Hi. In this video, I'd like to explore reverence, as well as its relation to what would seem to be its opposite, irreverence, especially with regard to their place and purpose within our everyday lives. And here's the usual table of contents for the material in this video. And as usual, you can find the same table of contents in the description of this video, along with links to the timestamps. Anyhow, if we were to start with a typical dictionary definition of reverence, it would go something like this. Honor or respect felt or shown, deference, especially profound, adoring, awed respect. So basically, reverence has to do with respect or deference, but an especially profound form of it. However, what we can revere can vary a lot from person to person. That's because what's worthy of deep reverence to one person can easily be valueless to someone else. As the old adage goes, one man's meat is another man's poison. Moreover, what we revere usually changes quite a bit as we make our way through life. For instance, the things that used to fill us with reverence when we were 12 years old are probably very different from what we've come to revere as adults. Basically, the metrics and measures of our reverence change as we ourselves grow and develop over time. And at this point, it's probably also important to note that there's always something self-referential in our experiences of reverence. After all, when we revere someone or something, we're the ones who are able to perceive what's worthy of our reverence in the first place. And we wouldn't be able to do that if those worthwhile qualities were completely alien to us, if they didn't reside within us somehow, if only in a very nascent and undeveloped form. In that regard, what we revere is intimately bound up with how we ourselves are. Oh, and a side note, compliments work the same basic way. When we compliment someone, we're also complimenting ourselves in a way. That's because we have to know enough about what we're complimenting to perceive and appreciate it in the first place. Basically, as in the case of reverence, there's always something self-referential about compliments. But let's get back to reverence. The thing about reverence is that it's related to how we are, but it's also very much related to how we want to be. And that's one of the paradoxes of it. On one hand, it always points to something already residing within us, at least at the level of possibility. But on the other, reverence involves recognizing a kind of distance between ourselves and whatever it is we're revering, as if that person or thing is somehow higher or more developed than we ourselves are. Of course, that distance can easily seem insurmountable, as if we could never attain those qualities ourselves. But even then, experiencing reverence has a way of subtly beckoning us toward fulfilling our deeper, more noble latencies. So in that regard, reverence is not only about recognizing what is worthy or honorable in someone else, but about the possibility of transforming our own lives so that we ourselves can fully embody whatever it is we revere in others. Like Goethe's idea of the eternal feminine, that's from Faust II, by the way, the experience of reverence draws us ever higher, and perhaps even towards something like a destiny. However, in order for all of that to be possible, we must learn to distinguish what's worthy of our reverence from what isn't. Basically, we have to develop a capacity for discernment, especially with regard to our contact with our world's higher and more noble qualities. And I'd also say that if we can develop that skill well enough, it can revolutionize our entire existence, both at the individual level as well as at the level of our collective humanity. For instance, how many TV shows do you think would survive if we could learn to orient ourselves to the world mostly in terms of reverence, and hence toward the ongoing task of distinguishing what's truly deep and resonant from what's basically just crap? How many of our politicians would continue to wield power if something like reverence were to become a primary criterion for our decisions in the voting booth? Or how eager would we be to commit senseless murders and genocidal wars if we were somehow able to revere life itself? Kind of makes you think, doesn't it? But my main point is that reverence is far more than an interesting phenomenon that occurs every now and then in our lives. Reverence not only calls us beyond our small, petty selves and into the wider plenum of our deeper possibilities, but it can have an analogous effect on our entire world, on our collective participation in the adventure of being human. But like I said a minute ago, reverence requires a capacity for discernment. But like so many other truly worthwhile things in life, discernment is a skill that requires practice. And in turn, practice has mostly to do with repeating an experience often enough so that it becomes second nature. But then the question becomes, how can we do that? How can we cultivate reverence by practicing the art of discernment, especially so that we can readily perceive what is worthy of our reverence in the first place? And I suspect that the main answer has to do with cultivating our capacity for mindful awareness. That is, our ability to be acutely cognizant of what's going on in the world around us, as well as within our own souls. Basically, increasing our capacity for reverence involves expanding our consciousness, a kind of revolution at the level of perception and experience. But of course, doing that also involves becoming keenly aware of what stands in our way. And probably the first of those things would be our fear, and especially our fear of changing, of evolving beyond what we already are. And the fact is that in one way or another, most of us are pretty thoroughly ruled by that sort of fear, and consequently choose to play it safe in life, mostly because doing so helps keep our anxieties and existential insecurities at bay. But on the other hand, to become what I would call a reverential being, that is, someone who travels through life mostly along the road of reverence, requires facing those sorts of fears and learning to take a chance on our deeper potentials. It requires learning to die in a way. To die as a small being, moment by moment, and along the way to become acutely aware of all of the myriad seductive ways that our attention gets distracted, deflected, and drawn toward what's not particularly worthy of our reverence. You know, the kinds of things that basically just waste our time and our lives. The kinds of things that don't build us up by making us better, stronger, deeper, or wiser, but that break us down by debilitating and toxifying us, and that ultimately leave us leading truncated and diminished lives in the process. And like I said, cultivating that kind of awareness takes practice, which in the case of reverence means repeating the experience again and again until it finally permeates our souls. In my own experience, meditation has been helpful with that process, mostly because it's a great way of cultivating mindful awareness, especially by learning how to clear a lot of the useless flotsam and jetsam out of our minds, which is also a way of expanding our consciousness. Of course, meditation isn't the only way of doing that. Creative and aesthetic experience can also be very helpful. But in any case, it's important to find a way of practicing reverence so that it becomes second nature. Basically, practicing reverence means learning to perceive the luminous depth of things and to orient ourselves to the world accordingly, rather than always filling our consciousness with things that only end up titillating and distracting us. And probably that's a revolutionary thought for a lot of us. The idea that we're free to decide what occupies our consciousness. Basically, the idea that we can fill our awareness with things that actually enhance our lives, even if that's not what the people around us or the larger culture seem to be doing. Sure, practicing that kind of thing can make us seem a little bit strange to other people, but in case you haven't noticed, the fact is that we're living our lives and not someone else's. Anyhow, I found that when we're able to do that, when we're able to fill our consciousness with sensations and experiences that allow us to feel reverence for someone or something in this world, it also makes it a little bit easier to have similar experiences a little further down the road. And at the same time, the more deeply we're able to experience reverence, the more profoundly it opens our hearts, which can eventually even turn our faces toward the ultimate brilliance of life itself, as in the case of the quote from Albert Schweitzer at the beginning of this video. That quote was actually from his autobiography, where he writes, Late on the third day, at the very moment when, at sunset, we were making our way through a herd of hippopotamuses, there flashed upon my mind, unforeseen and unsought, the phrase, reverence for life, which I would say is a significant step toward resacralizing the world itself. But if all of that's true, if ultimately our experiences of reverence call us beyond ourselves and ultimately towards something like reverence for life, toward a fundamental resacralizing of all existence, then what about irreverence, which would seem to move in the exact opposite direction? Well, maybe the first fairly obvious thing to say is that the whole point of life is not actually to be as reverent as possible. That's because wisdom in this world is about being able first to perceive what the present moment is asking of us, and then to respond harmoniously and fruitfully to whatever that is. And yeah, sometimes life is definitely asking us to be reverent, but sometimes it's also asking us to be irreverent. An example: comedy and humor more generally. When you think about it, a lot of comedy and humor has to do with irreverence, with being strategically inappropriate and even offensive. Basically, with transgressing against how we habitually see the world, and perhaps more importantly, how we want to see the world. And along the way, humor can serve the invaluable function of deflating our silly pretensions, our self-importance, and our hubris, all of which can very easily become our prison, our way of immuring ourselves within the high fortified bastions of our overweening self-seriousness. And to escape that sort of sad destiny, it's important to experience the opposite of reverence and solemnity every now and then. The larger reality of this life is that it's important to be an imbecile sometimes, a clown and a buffoon and an ignoramus. As the poet William Blake once famously noted, "If the fool would persist in his folly, he would become wise." In other words, wisdom doesn't trade exclusively in reverence. At points, it requires the counterweight of everything that is its exact opposite. And the fact is that our irreverence can serve as a vehicle for transcendence every bit as much as our reverence can. I suspect that's one of the main reasons we go to comedy shows in the first place. Of course, at one level, we go just to laugh and have a good time, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I suspect that we also go because we're looking for something that we don't usually find in the everyday run of life. Basically, we go mostly because we're hungry for irreverent truths, for all of the powerful verities that our world tries hard to disown and censor and erase. We go because we're looking for something, and for someone, probably some sort of madman who, against all odds, isn't quite as confined and enslaved as the rest of us are. And we're searching for that because, underneath it all, we'd probably like to become a little more like that ourselves. And so when we encounter a soul along the road of life who's relatively liberated, someone who improbably refuses to kowtow to all of our world's ridiculous hollow gods, someone like the fool from the tarot deck, who's willing to step over the dizzying precipice of our world's edicts and imperatives, it gives us implicit permission to liberate ourselves a little bit more too. In other words, we go to comedy shows partly because we're searching for our own transcendence. We go because part of us still longs to see with other eyes and measure with other measures. However, like learning to revere, learning the subtle art of irreverence also requires developing discernment. After all, not all of our tin gods are actually worthy of our irreverence, and there's always wisdom in choosing our battles well. Furthermore, like reverence, irreverence requires courage. That's first because our world is not always receptive to the strange charm of irreverence or to its strategic importance in our lives. After all, one of the most cruel things we can do to our fellow human beings is to lead them toward the truth. And I think that even a casual reading of history indicates how we human beings typically react when that sort of thing happens. Basically, it's a lot like the fable of the emperor's new clothes, or perhaps the allegory of Plato's cave if you're more philosophically inclined. In any case, becoming a bearer of strategic irreverence means breaking the trance of everyone's comfortable illusions and self-deceptions, which, by the way, we all have to one degree or another. But of all of the possible uses of irreverence, probably the one that requires the most courage would be irreverence toward our own false idols, toward all that is cheap and flimsy in us that we take way too seriously, and perhaps most of all, irreverence toward our own self-importance. And that, in turn, means learning to laugh at ourselves, at all of our ridiculous self-serving judgmentalism, at all of our inane ideological dreams and fantasies, and perhaps more than anything else, at all of our silly pretensions to being just plain right. Damn it! Okay, so I guess I'd like to end this video with something of a professorial rant. I know, surprising, huh? Sometimes I wonder about what we're really teaching our students. Sure, we professors are pretty good at inundating our students with torrents of factual information, and I suppose that there's a time and a place for that. But how often do we go out of our way to teach them to revere what they're learning, or to treat it with strategic irreverence when life's greater wisdom is calling for that? Moreover, how often do we teach our students the kinds of discernment and courage that make reverence possible in the first place? I wonder, because sometimes it seems to me like we spend an inordinate amount of time teaching the most trivial sorts of things, the kinds of things our students will probably forget in a year or two anyhow, and very few of the lessons that are truly enduring and important, which would include not only how to revere, but also how to embody beauty and real value in our lives, as well as, God forbid, how to move through life with at least a modicum of wisdom. You know, basically, how to be a decent human being, living a worthwhile life. I don't know. Seems kind of important to me. Because the obvious fact is that just because we've taught our students to be knowledgeable and smart doesn't automatically mean that we've taught them to live toward what really burns in this world, or to fall in love with the adventure of human existence. But hey, maybe that's just me and my doubtlessly irreverent view of the educational process. Must keep middle-aged cynicism under control. There, that's better. But seriously, it really seems more than a little strange to me. The fuck, bro. Intellectually speaking, that is. Anyhow, thanks as always for watching, and as always, take care of your soul.